We're living in times where people never mean what they say. This is something that's been sticking out on all sides of the aisle here. Take, for example, Jimmy Kimmel's recent statement that MAGA was blaming the assassin on having been radicalized by everybody else but themselves. What this statement means, literally, if you run it through AI and ask it, give me the literal meaning of this statement, AI basically gives you back that the meaning is that MAGA wasn't even considering the possibility that it might have had anything to do with the radicalization of Charlie Kirk's assassin. That's what Jimmy Kimmel literally said, and yet that's not what people took him to mean. They basically, even a huge part of progressive circles, took him to actually mean with that statement that MAGA was to be blamed for the whole thing. In other words, that the assassin was one of them, that he identified them with the group. Even when he came back to clarify, and he basically repeated the same thing and said his intention was not to blame the assassination on one specific camp, but to point out that one specific camp is blaming it without even having any kind of evidence immediately on the other side, without taking any responsibility or any possible responsibility for what's happening here. Even then, when he came back and said that, when he made it more explicit, people were still not taking his words for his words, but were saying he was insinuating again, blaming MAGA for the whole thing. This is a phenomenon that can be called the hermeneutics of suspicion, where you basically take the words of someone and instead of taking it as a statement, you look at it as being part of a bigger narrative. And instead of looking at it as a position, as a point of view, you override it by placing it into your personal narrative, into your own prejudice. It's something that I was constantly acquainted with when I was reading postmodern literature. Postmodern literature was mostly coming from a hermeneutics of suspicion. So when postmodern critics were turning at traditional philosophers, they basically never assumed that the philosophers meant what they said. They always came up with ad hoc explanations for why what they are saying is not what they mean, but how it has a second layer, and on that second layer, what the person is saying is something that's outrageous, something that's horrible, something that's evil, and on that second layer, the statements themselves are a function of colonization, etc., etc. So whatever you say, whatever claims you make, they're never taken as claims, they're never taken as meaning, but they were always taken as being part of some kind of conspiracy, if you want, or some kind of theory that places you within a different context than you're willing to place yourself. And I think this is something that you can observe on all sides happening today. Same thing with Charlie Kirk himself. When he was making claims that to me seemed reasonable, they were usually taken up to mean something entirely different. And it was people being very sturdy and very insistent to know that what he actually means is, and then they fill in, of course, the rest with the most horrible ideas that you can actually think of. And this is a very fascinating phenomenon that I think is spreading more and more. The results of which are, I think, very obvious, because the moment you feel like you're not being taken by your word and you're not being allowed to mean what you're saying, you don't have any more subjects meeting each other as subjects, but you are being treated as an object. You are being treated as a data point, you're being treated as a symbol, as something that simply proves the other side's narrative and point of view, and doesn't give you the allowance to actually speak your mind, doesn't give you the allowance to express your mind as your mind. You're not meeting each other as co-equal subjects, but you're being looked upon as someone who is just nothing else but the means of somebody else to get their own most meaningful narrative and most meaningful version of reality. And this, of course, is at the source of human conflict. When this is happening, you have basically a clash that is unavoidable, since a felt sense of not being seen, a felt sense of not being recognized by the other, a felt sense of not being experienced as human, is something that inadvertently just raises certain emotions in us. Certain emotions of being basically left out, being basically excluded, almost like being excluded from the tribal experience itself. And this itself forces the other side to consolidate with others around them. In other words, they're basically doing the same back to you as you are doing unto them. So, in other words, they search for their own circle, they search for their own tribal identity, from the point of which, of course, then you become just nothing else but an object, an alter, something that's foreign, something that's out there, and something that's not really worthy being engaging with on the level of subjecthood itself. And this is a culture of permanent conflict that we're creating here.